Okay, well, welcome everyone to the virtual world of the Eastside Freedom Library. I'm Peter Ratcliffe, the co-executive director, and this evening we have a great program, a discussion of a new book, Michael Goldfield's The Southern Key, Class, Race, and Radicalism in the 1930s and 40s. We have assembled a blue ribbon panel of historians and activists and even uh, an attorney and even a student scholar activist who have all read Michael's book. And the plan for this evening is Michael is going to give us a presentation, and then we will hear from each of our reader discussants. And And then hopefully we will have the opportunity for those of you who are in the audience to use the chat to type in questions or comments that you might have. The Eastside Freedom Library is committed to inspire solidarity, advocate for justice, and work for equity for all. We have been shifting, as many of you have, to the world of virtual communications to try to do this work. We're now beginning to imagine the possibilities of doing things in person. But one of the treats of doing things this way is that we have people, as I look at the screen, from all over the country joining us for this conversation tonight. And that's really great. So our featured author and scholar activist is Mike Goldfield, whom I imagine I've known for 30 odd years. And Mike has long been a scholar activist in Detroit, though his interests have ranged around the country. I first read his book, The Decline of Organized Labor in the United States, a book that is well worth still reading. But I want to recommend Mike's first book, The Decline of Organized Labor in the US. And Mike taught for many years at Wayne State University. Our panelists this evening are Sid Carlson White, who is an undergraduate student activist at Yale and has worked with the Jackie Robinson Foundation, among others. And we're just delighted to have him with us. John Mackerly, who is an oral historian with the Iowa Labor History Oral Project. And John has been a close associate for probably more than 20 years. My new friend, Cornelia Weiss, who is an attorney and was recently in a working class history course through the New Brookwood Labor College that I co-taught, which is how I met Cornelia. And she's been doing very interesting work on the role of the US military and military occupation in both Germany and Japan in maintaining, if not instituting to begin with, gender inequity in pay scales. We have Michael Hansen, who comes to us by way of his sister, Kathy, who has introduced us. Kathy is a longtime activist in the American Postal Workers Union locally and will be participating in a program next week in this format at the Eastside Freedom Library. But Michael is a longtime activist in the Airline Pilots Association and in progressive politics in Atlanta, Georgia. He's going to hold down the South for us tonight as part of this conversation. We're going to start with Michael, and then we will be hearing from our four reader discussants, and then we will be hearing hopefully from you. So, Michael, you are empowered to share your screen and take it away.
Okay, great. So I want to say that it's an honor to be here at the Eastside Freedom Library. I've known Peter actually for more than 30 years because I just discovered the comments he gave me in 1985 on my 1987 book, The Color of Politics. So that's more than 3 decades. So I've known Peter a long time. It's been on my bucket list. I had given up hope, but here we are. So my book has half a dozen different major themes. I just want to outline them briefly and then talk about one or two. If there's other things, I'm certainly open to questions about anything about it. So the first theme of the book is the centrality of the South for everything that's going on in the country and actually the whole history of the country. I outline that to a certain extent in the book. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Secondly, the book takes issue with common perceptions about the South, that there hasn't been that much labor struggle, that unionization has been impossible. And I try to document a history of militant labor struggle, some of it interracial, some of it civil rights oriented. The Southern Key focuses on the 1930s and 1940s, particularly on Alabama, including Bessemer and Birmingham. And it looks at the successes and feats of labor in this part of the country. And it argues that despite the significant successes, the defeats and the failures in the South have pretty much determined what's happened in American politics since then. The weakness of interracial unions when the civil rights movement developed in full bloom, the existence of white backlash without interracial unions to combat it, and the evolution of the Republican Party, and also the Democrats, I argue too, from Goldwater to Trump in pretty much a straight line. And another theme in the book is that their lessons on how to organize and what not to do are completely relevant today, including to the recent campaign in Bessemer at Amazon. So we'll start with the South. The South is the least organized, most politically backward part of the country. It's been that way for a long time. Du Bois, at the very end of Black Reconstruction, many people don't get quite to the end, but Du Bois says the real issue about why there's no socialism in the United States is the question of why there's no liberalism in the South. The South is the most backward part of the country. It's the key to change in the country. And it's the 5 deep South states where cotton plantations, slavery, and sharecropping most dominated the economy and the politics of the country. The legacy of slavery is important, as the 1619 Project tries to argue, but I argue also that there's more involved than just what happened with slavery, including what happened with the labor movement. So what are the specifics about the South? The South has had a long history of disregard for human life. And this extends, I saw an interesting statistic not long ago, that the murder rate among whites in the 1850s in Georgia was 100 times greater than in New England. And whites killed each other. The NRA says guns don't kill each other, people do. They killed each other with whips, with knives, with axes, and of course with guns, and most everything else you can think of. And this disregard for human life, 80% of the now almost 1,500 executions since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976 have been in the South. Over half in 3 states alone: Texas, Oklahoma, and Virginia. Virginia now moving out of the category of a death penalty state. There's the lowest level of support for public education and healthcare. In 2015, 17.1% of Texans had no health insurance, which was nearly twice the national average of 9.4%. The lack of working class organizations has led to atomization, individualism, and the increased receptivity to manipulation by dominant economic interests. As a result, the South is a region where the largest percentage of white people are birthers, meaning they think Barack Obama was born someplace else in Africa rather than the United States. They reject evolution and the existence of global warming. And some of these statistics are astounding. There are some states in the South where a majority of whites are birthers. And then there are states in the upper Midwest, the East Coast and the West Coast, where less than 10%, and a few states where only 2 or 3 or 4% of whites are birthers. The union growth in general in the country as a whole over the last century and a half, including in the South, takes place in enormous waves. So very little tends to happen incrementally, and then there are huge upsurges. So the 1870s was a period, railroad workers went on general strikes across the country. And as Peter documents in his book, Black Labor in Richmond, the Knights of Labor were strong throughout the South, highly organized in Richmond and elsewhere. The IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, radical syndicalist union, organized woodworkers across the South, in particular in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. During World War I, labor organizing took place across the South and the country as a whole. Union membership went up from 2 million to 5 million, 2.5-fold increase from 1914 to 1920. The period I look at in my book in particular is the 1930s and 1940s, where there was huge upsurge. And then there was the public sector upsurge in the 1960s and 1970s, where public sector unionism went from a few percent to almost 40%, where it remains today. And then there are the successes and failures in the contemporary South. So I talk a good bit about Alabama and talk about Alabama exceptionalism. Here's a map of Alabama for those who aren't familiar with it. Here's Birmingham. Can you see my arrow on there? Okay, so here's Birmingham. Bessemer is almost walking distance if you're in for a long walk. And then there are other industrial centers, which actually, even though the original industries that were there in the 30s and 40s have left, there's new industries there, except right up here, this is the Tennessee River. TVA is in Muscle Shoals, which isn't on this map, but that's somewhere right around here. Huntsville, let's see where else we have. Gadsden was a major center, a completely CIO town in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. And then Tuscaloosa, where the University of Alabama is, now has a Mercedes-Benz plant. The figures I get vary, but it seems like sometimes they have as many as 8,000 or 10,000 workers in the assembly plant there. And then the corridors along the interstates are filled, and this is the fastest growing parts production area in the country. So while there's been a change, let's see. So the center of organizing in the 30s and 40s was the Birmingham Bessemer area. Mine Mill, a communist-led union, had a very big local, Muscoda local in 123 in Bessemer, which Horace Huntley writes about a bit in his dissertation. Steel was organized, coal mines, iron ore, and these industries were all roughly 50% Black, some of them more, sometimes steel, sometimes metal mining was more. And this organizing took place across the state. By the early 1950s, 25% of the state was unionized. And to put this in perspective, there's no state in the United States that has 25% unionization. Last I looked for 2020, Hawaii has close to 24%. After that comes New York, 23, 22%, and so on. So this was important. Alabama and Birmingham in particular were a center of civil rights activities. The southern part of the state, if you can imagine the map that I had there, was the cotton growing area. Sharecroppers were organized, engaged in gun battles. The Scottsboro campaign in 1931 about a group of Black youth who had been falsely accused of raping two white women. And interestingly, the miners and other workers showed a lot of solidarity with workers who had less leverage. In 1935, there was a strike of 12 to 1,500 Black female laundry workers in Birmingham who were all going to be fired, and thousands of steel workers and miners came to the picket lines and shut the laundries down. Mine Mill was defeated in a racist campaign by the United Steelworkers in 1949, which was part of what I consider the degeneration of important CIO unions. And in a phrase that Peter has made famous, wall to wall, in particularly looking at the Union of All Workers based in Hormel and other places in Minnesota, unions, particularly the steel workers, organized the counties around, the 5 or 6 counties around Birmingham, wall to wall. Cotton textile, which was difficult to organize in the South as a whole, was all at one point fully unionized in Alabama. This is a headline from Gadsden, which had major cotton mills. And this is from, I think there's a date on here someplace. I can't read it. But in any case, in the 1930s, they struck and won unions. They didn't wait for a vote. The unions and labor organizing had successes in Mississippi, Jackson, Vicksburg, Natchez, and in Laurel, Mississippi was a complete CIO town. Of 30,000 people in the town, 6,000 belonged to the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And the last industrial plant was organized in 1948. It was a cotton mill. And the racist Senator Bilbo and the congressman, both outspoken white supremacists who defended lynching, came to town to defeat the union, and the cotton mill was overwhelmingly white, and they voted overwhelmingly for the CIO union. So a lot of this is documented in my book, The Southern Key. This was an area of continuing civil rights activity, even when Mine Mill was defeated and the steel workers degenerated. Mine Mill workers went and took over the NAACP around the state. The National couldn't figure out why they disliked the CIO union so much. There were people from Mine Mill involved in the Montgomery bus boycott. When SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, went to organize the Black Panther Party, or the Lowndes County Freedom Party, as they called it, which had the Black Panther as a symbol, they met older activists who'd been involved in the sharecroppers campaign and told them that they had to be armed if they were in Lowndes County. Even in 1982, Birmingham honored Hosea Hudson, who was a communist leader of the coal miners and the steel workers, who was kicked out during the McCarthy period. And as for traditions, Angela Davis's family were active in Birmingham, which is where she was born. And some of these traditions continue to this day. Okay, so Another theme of the book is that these defeats from the 1930s and 1940s left civil rights oriented unions smaller and isolated. The steelworkers, I argue in the book, contrary to most of the scholarship that sees the steelworkers and Philip Murray as sort of anti-racist going against the tide, that the union was thoroughly racist, wouldn't appoint black organizers, particularly in the South. And they did nothing to come to the aid of the civil rights movement. This led to the hegemony of white backlash. This is George Wallace, for people who don't know, same symbol behind Wallace and Trump. The strategy for the Republicans appealing to whites on a racist basis in the South was laid out by Nixon's advisor, Kevin Phillips, in the emerging Republican majority. There's a lot of attempts for conservatives and others to portray Goldwater, but particularly Ronald Reagan, as somehow benign and not very racist. Both of his campaigns after the nomination began in Philadelphia, Mississippi. He used familiar white supremacist slogans, "The South shall rise again," "I believe in Southern rights." He launched both campaigns at the Neshoba County Fairgrounds, Philadelphia, Mississippi. And for those who didn't know, this is a picture of the first sit-in in 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina. These are the three civil rights workers who were kidnapped, tortured, and murdered in Philadelphia, Mississippi. This is the FBI poster that says that they were last seen in Philadelphia. So the symbolism for Reagan appealing to absolute white supremacy is fairly clear. And there's a pretty straight line of that to Trump and the Republican Party. So I'm going to leave some of particularly the contemporary stuff for later if people are interested. Also, the types of lessons that one can learn about how to be successful and how not. So I'm going to take this down if I can.
Here we go. Sid, so we're going to start with Sid Carlson White. Take it away, Sid.
Yeah. So this was really, for me, an incredibly enjoyable book to read, in large part because of the way it sort of intentionally interrogated a lot of our understandings of the trade unionist history in the 20th century in a lot of different places at once, especially in a lot of different industries. And I think that's kind of good because it's one of the only ways that we really get to ask these questions about like what exactly is going to be remembered from the history of organized labor and what is not. Because I think like the central premise of the book that seeks to explain like why what are the forces of the South that like prevented organized labor from having a foothold are pretty interesting, but I think they can only be fully appreciated if we really get an intentionally broad understanding of the ways the industries of the region and indeed the country fit together in that particular way. And I think that was particularly enjoyable for me because in between like reading pages and chapters of the book, I would open up my Spotify and listen to Tennessee Ernie Ford's 16 Tons, or in some other cases spend more than half an hour watching modern day industrial processes of steel making. So things which I just really had no understanding of, and like prior to reading this book. And it made me realize that like the physical human effort that goes into these industrial processes is so deeply important for understanding how organized labor formed, how it it built itself up, how it collapsed, and all of those different factors. And that really meant a lot to me, because I think I have a lot of different understandings of the politics of the Midwest, where I'm from, and the politics of the South bouncing around in my head, especially in terms of how, for example, a national Black Southern politics is created, as opposed to, say, Northeast, Midwest, or West Coast Black political histories, and getting to focus very specifically on what makes the South different, not just in its specifically racial interactions, but in its labor history interactions, was really enjoyable for me, because I think it allowed me to put aside some of my ideologies about the history of various politicians and political minds from the South, and really begin to think about what a history from below of this region looks like, and how we can use it to both counter our assumptions about the backwardness of the South and its origins, as well as really get some up close and personal histories and stories of the way a lot of these individual actors built their collectives.
Do you want to leave us with a question, Sid?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, so I think my big question is kind of what I started with. This is a question of, this book is powerful because of its ability to interrogate questions about what exactly got remembered and what didn't. Because I'm really thinking about the woodworking unions and the loggers. It's what as historians, what should we think about why these sawmill and logging unions are so under discussed and so under recorded, and more importantly, how do we know that, or how can we suspect that a contemporary history of a movement or of a labor organization is in the process of not being fully recorded properly, especially as we think of for example, the Amazon unionization effort in Bessemer today. It's why did this particular history generate the type of press coverage that it did compared to a lot of other actions? And how can we, as historians of right now, of historians of yesterday, historians of 2 weeks ago, historians of 3 months ago, understand those processes as they happen in real time, and not just with the benefit of the hindsight of our understanding of all of these unions?
Great. Thank you, Sid. Cornelia, are you willing to go next, please?
Absolutely. So I want to thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm quite delighted to be here, and delighted to read the book, and I thank you for the book. For me, I was surprised to learn from it that the percentage of workers unionized in Alabama in 1945 was and is higher than the percentage of union workers in any state in the United States today. For my own personal research, this led me to wonder whether that reality affected the priority placed on unions in 1945, when the post-World War II US military occupations in Japan and Germany began. So let's simply look at General MacArthur in post-World War II occupied Japan. In his first meeting with the government of Japan in October 1945, he expressly encouraged the unionization of labor. And as he stated, that it may be clothed with such dignity as will permit it an influential voice. And the US then, as a result of a request from MacArthur, sent a labor delegation to provide advice on labor issues in post-World War II Japan. And one of the delegates was a member of the AFL. The CIO did not send a member with that delegation. And the US Department of Labor appeared to be involved in both post-World War II occupied Japan and Germany. And when I read your book, I was struck that other than a mention of a US Labor Department engineered settlement on striking Goodyear workers, that the book did not mention the Department of Labor. And given that the book covers the period of the 1930s and 40s, I was left curious as to why there was no mention of Frances Perkins, who, as you know, served as Secretary of Labor during that period from 1933 to 1945. And was this because the US Department of Labor, under her leadership, played no role in the US South? I also want to thank you for including in your book what you personally witnessed, and this at the International Harvester in Chicago, as you state the malleability of racial attitudes on the part of whites when aggressive union leadership is provided. I was intrigued by your conclusion regarding Operation Dixie, that the leaders' personal prejudices prevented them from choosing a broad, egalitarian, solidaristic labor movement, both as a goal in itself and as a best means of organizing. And that leaves me with the question, is aggressive union leadership being provided today, to including eliminating Jane Crow attitudes that result in pay gaps hurting Black women and their families? And why is union leadership today still refusing to engage in proactive actions to overcome wage discrimination against women, as evidenced by its failure to even submit an observation to the ILO about the Equal Remuneration Convention for Women and Men, unratified by the US even 70 years after its promulgation? Now, understanding that an author might not have control over what goes on the cover of their book, my question is that the case also for titles? Given the book's assessment that women were key, but often invisible, virtually never appointed to leadership positions, and yet in place after place, women were in many cases the driving forces, I am curious about the decision to exclude the word gender from the title of the book. I anticipate the book, had it been entitled The Southern Key: Gender, Race, Class, and Radicalism in the 1930s and 1940s, would have had even higher sales and a broader readership. The book contains so many nuggets of insightful gender analysis. To include the power of women, for example, you bring out in West Virginia, where it was women who prevented the bull moose special from returning by tearing up the railroad tracks. To include costs to unions and their members of union leaders who told the women who were members of the unions not to make an issue of women's rights. That is, if I understand correctly, includes don't demand equal pay for women, accept harassment, accept rape as job conditions. To include within unions, refusing to hire women. And when unions did hire women, paying women substantially less than unions. And to include what I gather were union negotiated contracts that paid women less than men even in government-run facilities. So as I conclude, 2 additional questions. Had unions not discriminated against women, but instead fought for women, would the percentage of unions, meaning their workers, not have declined, but would have instead grown? And have unions learned the lessons of the 1930s and 40s? Or are they simply repeating them unlearned today? I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Cornelia. Mike Goldfield, I hope you're just taking notes and you'll get your turn back up at bat again as we gather the last 2 sets of comments and questions.
No, that is my plan.
Excellent. Mike Hanson, please.
Unmute here.
Yes, sir.
Thanks for having me. I read this book from the perspective of my own union experiences in the Airline Pilots Association and my education background from a military academy. I saw the same issues and challenges that the coal miners faced, minus the machine gunning and the beatings, of course, in my own experiences in the union over the last 20 years. And I kept asking myself, if I were an organizer today, pragmatically, how could I use this information in this book to be an effective leader? I know there's probably some organizers that are viewing this right now and asking that same question. So I turned to Michael Goldfield's claim that the social movements, especially labor and economic reasons, are the moving forces in society. Their failure back in the 1930s and 40s is what has produced our current environment. And I thought the path through union membership espousing democratic values has to be converted into political representation in order to be successful. They didn't do that in the 1930s. That's what I got out of the book. They didn't do it in the 1930s, but it did happen here in Georgia in 2020. I think that Stacey Abrams, Raphael Warnock, and John Ossoff, perhaps through their education and looking at the past and the history of books like Michael's book, were able to use that information to create a strategy here in Georgia that was successful. The exceptionalism of Alabama, I had no background information on or education on, and it made me think, especially the failure part of it, of how today do we convert unionization in places like Amazon or some of the automobile factories into a political force? How do we turn unionization into political power? Exploiting it is how we become successful. When we talk about the coal miner's strength, somehow all that strength never actually got turned into political power, despite some of their successes. Another basic premise of the book, with race being a reason for labor's failure, I think it has to be layered on top of other factors that resulted in the failure of unions in the South. Some of it is national versus local control, appointed leaders versus elected leaders. When I was reading the book, and Michael talks about how some of the union leadership were making $50,000 a year when the average miner or steel worker was making $3,500 a year. It reminded me of Nelson Mandela's book, Long Walk to Freedom, where the ANC leadership changed from being professionals, doctors, lawyers, engineers, to political people, and having their livelihood depend on being reelected destroyed the effectiveness of that organization. And I think that parallel was also reflected in the coal miners and the steel workers union as well. Pragmatically, looking towards the future, I kept asking myself as I was reading the book, how can I use this information to be successful in the future? I have to make inroads with organizing and including African Americans, families. As Cornelia was talking about, women are vitally important. We have to make allies of other unions and government. We have to never forget that we can't be a business union where we're cozying up to industry executives or the banking and investment community. As I was reading through the book, I thought about what happened here in Georgia in the last election. Kelly Loeffler's monotonous repetition of the catchphrase, radical leftist agenda, communism, socialism, and how that was such a powerful force in the 30s and 40s. Also, the violence attributed to Antifa and BLM, some of it being exaggerated, is exactly how many of our presidents were elected, by playing off that fear of violence, kind of the racism in the South being used to solidify the white vote down here. As the questions come up from the folks that are watching, I hope that it can kind of guide us in more of a discussion on how are we going to be more effective in the future using this information from the book and the failures of it so that we can actually make progress.
Thank you, Michael. Great. Our last panelist is John Mackerly. John?
Yep. Mike, thank you for writing this book. It's a sort of big, ambitious project that doesn't get written, the kinds of book that doesn't get written enough anymore. And for me, it was in sort of this incredible biographical touchstone. My paternal grandfather was a sheet metal worker in Birmingham in the 40s and 50s. And my union experience, I come out of a United Electrical Workers local, so I'm very familiar with that tradition that you talk about. And then, my work in Iowa, I've come into contact with the history of the FE and the UE and the packing house workers, and Don Harris, who makes an appearance in the book. So again, I found it very enjoyable just from a personal perspective. There are four things that really jumped out at me in reading this book. Well, one, I think that your emphasis on both your identification and emphasis on both structural and associational power are really useful. Again, a book that forwards our attention to thinking, to pulling out the power relationships is critical. I wonder though, and I realize this was something that you push back against a good deal in the book, but the notion of local power is something that you really don't address in a great deal. And I wonder, again, sort of where that might fit for you within the context of both structural and associational power, right? And this is in part, again, a question that's based around the experiences of local activists, right? I mean, you can appreciate what structural power is, you can appreciate what associational power is. And in fact, again, in an organizational context, you can try to build associational power, but that associational power is so often grounded in whatever local context you happen to find yourself in. And so I wonder if an analysis that doesn't take local power seriously just misses a piece of the puzzle. an important piece of the puzzle. The next issue is, and I will apologize that some of these questions are going to feel like I'm a person with a hammer in search of a nail, and so I apologize for that, because that may be true. So you again, in terms of the way, this is kind of a historian's question, but I do think it has a relevance for how we think as organizers. So you make a very strong point in one of your footnotes about the unreliability and sort of irrelevance of oral history. And I wonder if, I address this for two reasons, and not just because I'm an oral historian. Oral history is, so oftentimes has that power, again, it kind of goes back to this local history question, right? Or the local power question. The way, in my experience at least, the way that so many people who are organizing on the ground engage with their own experience and in ways that allow them to become active, comes through the storytelling and whether or not oral histories are, regardless, I think, of necessarily whether or not a particular oral history has direct connection to some kind of outside referent. And again, I'm really trying to avoid the way that oral historians talk about this stuff from a theoretical perspective. Just thinking about it in terms of organizing, I wonder if that, again, might be a loss here, in the sense that that there's a sort of human element that oral history engages with, that from both an organizing perspective and a kind of ability to build stories in a way collectively to move people, that there may just be a piece missing here with regard to that. Okay, so to move to some more sort of structural things here. The other issue that I thought was really interesting. So as I say, like I'm a Southerner who came to the Midwest and got very interested in both Southern and Midwestern history. So I want to sort of push back a little bit on this question of the Southern Key. One of the things that I'm often been struck by, that people haven't written enough about, is that, there in the late 40s, when you have this wave of early right to work states, one of the group that's oftentimes missed, right, is this group of Iowa and the states just to the west of Minnesota, right? And it's this kind of missing part of the equation. Well, perhaps the South really was the key, but we have these other parts of the US that clearly can and do harbor some of the very elements that we oftentimes ascribe as sort of fundamentally Southern. And again, this is the sort of me being the person with a hammer question. I wonder sometimes if Iowa isn't a good example of what a Southern state might have looked like that was effectively organized, right? Because it was, right? You had these, even though FE and UE locals tended to go into the UAW, you had a powerful UPWA, you had the creation of a real honest to goodness progressive movement in a state that was, prior to the late 20th century, fundamentally conservative, and that is moving back in that direction now as those local areas of organizing suffer from deindustrialization and break apart, and you're seeing that shift back to the right. So again, I wonder if you could put it in a larger perspective. And then I promise this is the last one. And I know this is because you've written about the public sector. And I wonder that, again, that's sort of a piece that feels like it's missing, because one of the things that made Iowa distinct, and again, that sort of buttressed Iowa's ability to push back against the right there in the late 70s, early 80s, was the organizing of the public sector. In 1974 is when it happens in Iowa. And I wonder, because again, Iowa and Alabama had, at least until very recently, the well, they were the states that had the right to work states that had the highest percentage of union density. They're roughly the same, like right around 10%. Iowa's has decreased recently because of the attacks on the public sector. And one of those missing pieces in Alabama is the public sector. And so again, I wonder if, when we have places like Virginia, North Carolina, particularly, right, where there are these kind of vicious attacks on the public sector and the capacity of public sector workers to organize. And I sort of wonder how that fits into the equation. So again, I apologize. That's a lot of things, but it was a wonderful book. And thank you very much for letting me talk to you about it.
Thank you, John. So, Michael, do you want to respond to some of these questions?
Yeah, sure. I'm not even sure I could respond to all of them in 3 hours. So
Right.
let me pick and choose. So I'm not going to do justice to everything, but I'm going to do some pot shots here. So Sid talks about why certain sectors are unknown or not written about. I think there's a current thing today, with the exception of the Amazon campaign, where a lot of things came together. Hardly anything's written about labor. If you get on Google and try to find out what's going on in the miners' strike in Alabama, you don't find anything in the mainstream press. It's all sort of Marxist groups that have, and of course the readership is very small. I've spent a lot of time in India, for example, and so I was corresponding with friends of mine to see what was going on with the farmers' strike. And then they had a general strike of 250 million people. There was nothing in the U.S. press on this for the first week or so. So I think in general, the lack of attention to labor issues is strong. Loggers and sawmills, as I argue, sawmill workers were as prevalent as textile workers, which has been written about a lot. Incorrectly, I argue. So those type of blind spots occur for all sorts of things with respect to minorities, with respect to women, and with respect to labor in general. So I want to touch on one issue, and here I have sort of an axe to grind. So Michael mentions politics and the involvement in politics and change in certain of the southern states, and also that the issues of violence and anti-communism come up and have always come up historically. I think much more important than election campaigns are organizing the workers in a state. And to give a historical example, which I don't discuss fully enough, but which I mentioned in my book, the Port Arthur area of Texas had one of the most right-wing congresspersons in the country, Martin Dies, who was the head of the House On-American Activities Committee. He was absolutely racist. The Port Arthur, I think it was Esso workers, oil workers, 10,000 of them unionized in 1941. And after they negotiated their contract, they said the first thing we're going to do is get rid of Martin Dies. This was not a radical union. They went door to door campaigning. They generated so much support that Dies decided not to run again. And they elected a sort of liberal anti-racist from this to replace him. So I think that that's much more significant. And I think if workers in Georgia and in Alabama could organize, the politics would change dramatically, not just marginally democratic. It's nice that we have a few fewer right-wing Republicans, but when I listen to some of the Democrats, I'm sort of horrified by the things they say. Let's see. I'm not sure about getting into the whole oral history conundrum, but I think that John raises an interesting question about Iowa and the Midwest. So there's nothing automatic about whether movements become radicalized. And I talk a lot in the book about what different leadership groups are able to do. And so in places where the most far-reaching changes and the changes in politics took place, it tended to be radicals, leftists, people consider themselves socialists, sometimes revolutionaries who had leading roles and where the transformations are greatest. And I talk about this in the book. Okay, and that brings me to Cornelia's questions, of which she has a whole series of them, and also the most incisive criticisms, starting with the title of the book. So I want to first mention a little bit about the international stuff. So I spent a lot of time studying union histories in other countries. I have a book's worth of material on the textile industry, including in Japan, of which I have a couple pages in the book. Originally, I had about 20 or 30 pages on international textile workers' struggles, and friends of mine and other people said it was too much of a diversion, which I don't think it was. But in any case, my reading of what happened in Japan is that in rebuilding the economy, the United States initially wanted higher wages, so these places weren't totally competitive with the United States, which still during this post-war period had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of textile workers in the South. But what happened is when unionization developed, the communists took a leading role, and the main labor federation was created, captured, whatever you want to say, by the left. And the United States occupation basically destroyed the union movement. And you have this enterprise unionism, which is what exists today. And Peter mentions the decline of organized labor. I've had these arguments with people. I collect international statistics. I've had people in Israel say, why don't you mention Israel? It's 80% unionized. I said, well, the Hisrodat, which is the main union federation, is also the biggest employer in the country. So I was a Teamster in Chicago, and the Teamsters owned 4 trucking terminals. And you could bet that there wasn't a real union in those facilities. So you have to look at the particulars of what's going on. The same thing with Japan. Enterprise unions are not really unions. Okay, her major point, though, is why there isn't more about, actually, as she points out, there's a lot about gender in the book, and why that isn't a major focus, and even in the title. And I think that's a legitimate question to ask. But one thing in particular, you can't throw all the unions together. There were a couple unions that were fairly good on these questions. One was the Food and Tobacco Workers Union, in which women were promoted to leadership positions in the union. The United Electrical Workers, which was also a significant percentage women. These are 2 communist-led unions. And the communist-led unions weren't all that good. The person who I quoted in Detroit that Cornelia mentions, who didn't want questions about discrimination against women raised, was a supporter of the left. But by far, the liberals, both black and white, were so much worse than anybody on the left with respect to women. So Operation Dixie, this is run by the so-called right-wingers who are all liberals. And as I say in the book, here's an industry in the South that's almost half female, and they hire white male veterans with no organizing experience. And I've painstakingly gone through, I look at pictures, but also names. You can't absolutely tell 100%, but I find very few, what Johnny Cash had a song, A Boy Named Sue, but any case, most of the names are pretty obvious what they are, and there's almost no women that these liberals hire. The same thing happens. So in the post-war period, the communist and left-wing union Negro American Labor Council put a priority over hiring for women, and they forced the GE plant in St. Louis to hire thousands of women. And that's in contrast to things that the NAACP was involved in. And it's fairly well known that even in the civil rights movement in the South, women played major roles. And with the exception maybe of Fannie Lou Hamer, almost none of them ended up in leadership roles. So I think that's an encouraging thing about the current period that we see in Black Lives Matter. There's women in main leadership positions, lesbian women no less, openly and outspokenly. So that's different. And I think across the board, so we look at the unemployed movement in virtually every place where I looked in detail, whether it be Detroit, Chicago, New York, Birmingham, and even Scranton, Pennsylvania, women are playing the dominant role, but they're never the spokesman for the organizations. So I think that's a critical factor, that in terms of the role that they played, most of this came out of how overwhelming it was as I did the research, not from the start. So I didn't realize in terms of the characterization of the unemployed movements all over until I'd finished pulling that stuff together. I think the sharpest differentiations, which is why race gets placed so centrally, were on how different leadership groups, different political tendencies deal with the race issue. I argue, and this has to do with the scholarship out there. So Walter Reuther, Philip Murray, and this whole slew of liberal anti-communists are portrayed as racially progressive. And I think all the research and all the material shows that they're absolutely cohorts with white supremacy. And that's, and even of people who are left-wing, right, like these people are liberals, and it's the white workers that are keeping them from being more anti-racist. And that's such a dominant trope in the labor history literature that a main thrust of the book was to debunk that and to pull the covers off of these people. I think that the treatment of women by unions is in some sense, I mean, it's certainly overwhelming, but it's much more diffuse in terms of differences. Left-wing unions differed back and forth. So one interesting thing, let's see if I can get some of these pictures up. So I've got a picture of the miners' strike. I've had people say to me, not people who've been down there, a lot of people have been down to the Bessemer and the Alabama talking to people, right? I've been sort of sheltered with the COVID thing, thinking that I'm not in my 20s anymore and that it's a little bit more risky to be running around. But if you look at the pictures of these miners, they're not only interracial, but there's, in one of the pictures I have of the people on the picket line, the leadership of the local, there are 3 or 4 women with picket line. I think that the differences are more diffuse, but it seemed to me that the liberals are worse, that the left was not as attuned. When I say the left, particularly the communists, were not as attuned to gender issues as they were to racial issues, except in certain types of situations. And it's a complex narrative to unwrap. I mean, maybe that should be my next book, or maybe that should be your next book. And was doing this research off and on for many, many decades. And I probably have enough material to look at every industry and union. And I just picked 4, mainly throwing in little tidbits here and there. But I mean, they're even worse. So I worked and was active at International Harvester, which was all UAW by the time I started. The FE was left-wing FE was long gone. But there were workers who came over from Tractor Works and McCormick Works to my plant who had been active in the union when the FE was there. And during World War II, women were a significant part of the workforces in these plants. And older workers, I say older, they're probably not as old as I am now, but I'm in my mid-20s, and these guys are in their 40s, and they're telling me how they the company consciously got rid of women who were in the plant. And until they started hiring women again, there were like 4 or 5 women in this plant that I worked in with 3,000-4,000 workers. They made women climb 3-story ladders carrying heavy buckets, which probably none of the men could have done. And when they couldn't do it, they told them they were let go. So the discrimination against women workers and the attitudes in society across the board were very, very extreme. And so that the unions that fought for women's issues and even elevated women to important leadership positions were totally exceptional. And they weren't dominant even in the left milieu, and they were absolutely absent from all the liberal unions. And that goes particularly with the established civil rights organizations, with the people and the sleeping car porters and their whole leadership. They were so much worse than the food and tobacco workers or people in the UE, for example. So I think that tearing that all apart would have been complex and maybe a book in itself. And perhaps it should have been in the title. But I try to note these contradictions throughout the book in almost every area, social movement and industry that I look at. Certainly, they're not issues that I tried to ignore.
All right, why don't we open up to people who have been patiently listening and watching. Chad Pearson, who's come all the way from Texas and has asked a long question in the chat. Chad, why don't you start us off this stage of the conversation?
Certainly. Can folks hear me?
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. Great panel. I enjoyed learning from you folks, and I really enjoy Mike Goldfield's book quite a bit, learned a lot from it. And I especially like how in all of your work, you really emphasize the importance of building solidarity. In other words, building solidarity is electing politicians is no substitute for building solidarity. And that's critical, and that's often lost in the historiography. But my question for you in your book is, I'd like you to speak a little bit more on employer organizing. You do a lot of wonderful work highlighting the failure of union organizers to break with racism. But certainly, as you know, there's a long tradition of employer organizing going back at least to the 1880s. These employers would get together. They would entice northern manufacturers to come to the South, promising that it's this land of of anti-unionism. And then, of course, they would get their hands dirty and engage in a fair amount of thuggery. And so can you speak to groups, I'm thinking like the Southern States Industrial Council or the Christian Americans? You know, these were some of the pioneers of the right to work movement. So look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Yeah, I don't talk so much about particular organizations, but I think that I talk a lot about repression in the book. So, and a lot of it's pretty violent. So in coal and steel in particular, West Virginia was seen as a non-union area, competing with coal from Pennsylvania and Illinois, which were the next two largest coal mining areas. They hired hundreds of basically assassins going around killing workers, and so it took an overwhelming effort to defeat these people and to organize, which the coal miners finally did in 1933. And as I argue in my book, and also in an article in Labor History, before there was any even symbolic labor legislation to justify it. So, yeah, there's a lot of material on, and the same thing took place in steel, a combination of employers, and actually Pennsylvania was worse than most places in the South for steel workers. They controlled the police forces in all the steel towns. They hired huge amounts of security people. In some of the La Follette hearings, it came out that they had arsenals that rivaled, you know, what you would see that the government, the federal government had in many places, stores of machine guns and tear gas and everything else. And in some cases, it was armed coal miners who marched into steelworking districts to assure that steelworkers organizers weren't killed and kept from organizing. So during the period in the South, and this is another thing that I mentioned a little bit, but that most of the anti-union techniques that were prevalent in the 1970s and 1980s, which I write about in The Decline of Organized Labor, were being used in the South in the 40s and the 50s. So the anti-union consultants, these rabid anti-communist organizations that I'm trying to remember the names of some of them, but they had publications, Workers' Truth and whatnot, and they were subsidized by employers. And this is one reason why the strategy of excluding the left and thinking you can beat anti-communism, and that's very prevalent today. Michael mentioned things in Georgia, right? There's nothing even the Democrats can do to keep from being called communists. So the CIO was just crazy to think that by hiring white male veterans, they wouldn't be red baited, right? So, you know, and they describe these very conservative union leaders as Bolsheviks and everything else, right? And we see that with the Democrats. You might as well take a strong stand, say what you believe. I mean, I don't know what Democrats believe, but if you're a socialist and you're on the left, you might as well just put it out there and let the chips fall my way, because the cautious type of approach where you pull your horns in doesn't save you from any of this. And so I was in a plant. I did a lot of organizing, talking to people. We had work stoppages. We had meetings on the shop floor. And, you know, people attack you, right? I'd have somebody stand up and say, "You sound like a communist." And I'd say, "Yeah, you look like a kiss the boss's ass." You know, and that usually stopped that conversation. So it's not an argument that you can engage in. And I think they can be exposed, but these types of organizations, anti-union organizations, have been around for a long time. There's a couple of good books on employer anti-union organizations. I mean, I'm not sure what there is to say because they follow certain patterns. Employers do everything that they can, but I think that the tactics that were used in Amazon, that were developed in the 70s and 80s, were being used during World War II, during the 40s and 50s in the South, when they weren't being used in other parts of the country. So that's a story worth telling. My book doesn't try to be comprehensive. There are lots of stories to tell. There are lots of interesting union things that I couldn't fit into the book. Probably long enough as it is, right?
Great. Thank you, Michael. Is someone else that hasn't had a chance to ask a question or make a comment want to jump in?
I could do that.
Yes, great. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Nick Budimir. I teach at Muskegon Community College. I was one of Michael's students about 15 years ago. Thanks a lot, Mike. I just ordered the book from Oxford. I guess I'm looking at Color of Politics and the section on the 30s, and I'm remembering back some of our references to Theodore Allen, and I also have our buddy Eugene Genovese here. So, like, you stress so much, when we talk about Ted Allen and the origin of the white race, that this sort of racial structure had existed at least since the defeat of Bacon's rebellion. Now, would you say that that sort of racial structure is always like a present commodity, available to be exploited in American society? Or would you say that in the 1930s, this is kind of, reconstructed for sort of the second half of the 20th century?
Nicholas, good to see you.
Good to be
Although
seen.
we've been in touch, I haven't seen you face to face in quite a long time. So I think that structures of racial oppression and racial attitudes, and I would also say the same thing for male supremacy and male chauvinist attitudes, which I think are derivative. And I don't really like the terms racism or sexism because they don't distinguish between attitudes. And one thing that Cornelia mentioned was about the attitudes of people and prejudices of people in Operation Dixie, and I wouldn't call them prejudices. It's an ideological mindset and what institutions they supported. But these things evolve, but the people who ultimately don't have strong interests in preserving the system, even if they have racist attitudes during periods of struggle, are at times abandon those attitudes. So the other thing I collect that isn't really in the book is stories of individual Black organizers, usually leftists, sometimes people who are communists, who go into all white environments and organize groups of largely white workers. So I sort of reject this identity, essentialism type thing. And so at the International Harvester plant in Louisville, they sent the farm equipment workers sent one black communist to organize a plant that was 90% white, and he organized the whole plant. Charlie Hayes, who was a congressman from Chicago before Bobby Rush, but had an illustrious career as a left-wing organizer and official in the United Packing House Workers. When he was 19 years old, he was sent down by the Young Communist League to Southern Illinois in an absolutely racist area. And he organized 300 white carpenters, led them out on strike, and their attitudes softened a little bit. And I give a couple of examples in the book and even some things from personal experience. Now, this doesn't mean that any of this is easy, but that it's interesting to note that individual attitudes of people who it's not necessarily in their interest to have these attitudes are malleable. I'm still waiting for some of the Trump supporters to support the coal miners' strike, since they are so big on coal miners. But I haven't heard any of them saying that. Maybe I'm not listening carefully enough. Maybe somebody else has heard that these people, that they're supporting these people at the Warrior Met coal mine. So I think that during periods of mass struggle, attitudes can potentially change. And some of it has to do with the struggle. Some of it has to do with the type of leadership that's offered in those struggles.
So we're almost out of time. I want to ask Meg Bruck if you would like to unmute and ask the question that you emailed in ahead of time, also mentioning Ted Allen. And we should all give a shout out to Ted Allen and his 2-volume invention of the white race. Meg, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, yeah, I just wondered if, Mike, if your approach as a historian has been affected by Ted Allen's concept of the white blind spot, and if so, how?
Yeah, so I actually know Ted from early on and was involved with him politically long before he wrote the book, which I've read many early versions of before it was finally accepted and published by Verso. And I think one of the notable things is that you look at the historiography that of Reconstruction and the Civil War, dominated not just by whites, but white Southerners, pro-Confederates. But going back to the color of politics, when I looked at John Brown, I had read, since the political tendencies I was in, we read all of Du Bois when I was still a student, and nobody published any of his things, and he was a real outlier at that point. But I read his book on John Brown. And when I went to write The Color of Politics, I read what all the prominent historians of the Civil War and Reconstruction had to say about John Brown. And every single white one, as in this recent film on the Great Lord Bird, which I couldn't even stand watching it. You know, it's all about his religiosity and violence and whatnot. But there wasn't one white historian who I found who had anything really good to say about John Brown. But Frederick Douglass, who was not that radical, he was a staunch supporter of the Republican Party, et cetera, was close friends with Brown and thought he was wonderful. The wealthy abolitionists in Boston funded John Brown, as they did William Lloyd Garrison. And then Du Bois said, and I have this on Facebook because John Brown's 150 or whatever, his birthday was up there and somebody posted on that. So Du Bois says of all the great heroes that I don't know if I can quote, that the dark souls of Africa have invigorated in the United States, one of these colorful Du Bois quotes, and he lists all these people. He includes Abraham Lincoln. He includes some of the Underground Railroad people. He includes Garrison. And he says, but above all, there's John Brown. So the disparity between what Black social scientists had to say or abolitionists had to say and what white historians had to say was just, for me, shocking. And I write about that for a few pages in The Color of Politics. So I think certainly there's this white blind spot. But for many of us who came of age, I think a transformation took place intellectually. First of all, there were the anti-colonial movements. There were dozens of countries that had liberation movements, independence after World War II. I mean, slightly before my time, but in the period of the 50s, you had many countries gaining independence. India was in 47, 48. The Algerian struggle was going on in the late 50s, et cetera, et cetera. In the 70s, we had the Portuguese colonies. And I think that forced intellectually many people to take a different look at the struggles that had taken place in this country and Reconstruction, the Civil War and whatnot. And then the Civil Rights Movement, which I was involved in, gave a big impetus for totally looking at these questions differently. So I think that does a white blind spot still exist? Surely. I mean, race is central to everything in the United States, and very few people seem to get the question right. And even the recent book, somebody mentioned the book on caste, and a number of the reviewers have said that there's no mention of class or capitalism or anything else. And recently I went back and read Cox's book, Caste, Class, and Race. And I decided that even though there were things that I didn't like about it when I read it originally long ago, like he's pro-Roosevelt and uncritical of the CIO, he's so much better than almost anybody writing generally on the question today. And that's a book that's been completely ignored, as opposed to other books that are much more meager intellectually and substantively that get a lot of play. So there's both a question of a white blind spot, but there's also ideological questions about people not being able to look truth in the face.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. And thank you for the question, Meg. I'm just putting the Oliver Cromwell Cox book in the chat. He too did not include gender in the title,
Nope.
but caste, class, and race is really a great classic. So we're out of time. I do want to exercise the privilege of the chair to say, Bruce Nissen, it's really great to see your face. It's been way too long, and I hope you're
Bruce.
well. Are you still in Florida, Bruce?
Yep, living in St. Petersburg in retirement. Yes, indeed.
Great. Well, it's great to see you. I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening, and thank Michael for writing the book and giving us a reason to have this conversation. And I want to thank Sid and Cornelia and Michael Hansen and John Mackerly for your comments and questions. And if you are not regular followers of the Eastside Freedom Library, I encourage you to become so. On our website, there is a get involved header, and if you click on that, you can get on our mailing list for future events. There's a lot we're still doing and will be doing. Next week, Kathy Hanson, who is with us this evening, will be part of the conversation of a new novel published by Hardball Press called Union Made, written by Eric Lotke, and Eric will be with us, and there will be a panel of people from the labor movement who have read Eric's novel, and we'll have a good conversation Tuesday evening, June 1st. And I would also just mention a little bit further out that on June 22nd, Tuesday evening, June 22nd, my former student, Carlos Hill, will be with us, and his new book on the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. Memorial Day will mark the 100th anniversary of that event. There was an interesting segment on 60 Minutes last night that was a wee bit out of date, but very interesting segment. And Carlos will be joining us on the 22nd and immersing us in the story of the Tulsa Race Massacre and what we can learn from that experience. One of these days we'll have Chad Pearson on the spot. I look forward to that. And it's great to see everybody. Thank you for joining us, and stay well, and keep pushing to the left.
Peter, thank you so much. And I want to thank everybody else, particularly people who had lots of questions. I mean, this is fun to engage in this sort of thing.
Yeah. I love that at academic conferences, you get 3 or 4 papers and 1 commentator, but at the Eastside Freedom Library, you get 1 presentation and 4 commentators. And it democratizes the production of knowledge, at least a wee bit. So I really do want to thank the people who took the time to read Mike's book and to bring questions to bear. And as I say, stay well. Thank you all. See you again soon, I hope. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.